Anyway.
Is there a danger that we're tonight is even becoming, once again, almost a wine line? That we're repeating with self-justification for why we are where we are and why things are as they are. We as a people have had times in our history where the likes of Sean Lemass and perhaps the likes of Gareth Fitzgerald, who had integrity, who have integrity, who had a vision. And I think we're missing the fact that as a people we've come through centuries of difficult times, but we've had leaders who are capable of taking us out of it. And it's cauterizing in a sense to have the general admission that we have this level of corruption. And if your judiciaries are appointed by the politicians, and power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and politics is the art of the possible, and getting power and keeping power is what politics are about, in a sense, why are we surprised that we are where we are? And until such time as we have an electoral system that actually creates a balance between clientelism and competent persons of integrity who have a vision and who have a sense of civic duty, then why are you surprised that you have expense abuse? Why are you surprised that you have builders in Britain of a certain Brothers getting 50 million from a nationalised bank to continue a project in Britain, or that a bankrupt bank is given 70 million at the drop of a hat, whilst people on social welfare are asked to forego 10%, and old people and young people are suffering? So I would say that this meeting, before we talk about Mr. McCarthy's plans, needs to think about, well, what do you do about it? Can we begin to talk about what we as a people are capable of doing, as opposed to reaffirming the sense of frustration and alienation? Why can't we begin to think about how do you create the leadership position? Because leaders matter. Mandela mattered. Lemass mattered. And that's what we need. Not to worry about Bertie Ahern bringing bags of money in from Manchester Airport.
I mean, it's interesting that you... Sorry, if I just make a brief comment on that. You know, maybe you're right. Maybe the whole nation understands how, if you take the views being expressed here this evening, how systemic the corruption is in this country, how deep it goes from the judiciary to the religious orders to the politicians to the bankers to the developers. My own guess is I don't think people do. I don't think people realise the depth or the extent of it. I think they have a grasp of, you know, Paddy the Plaster and this nonsensical storyline of Bertie Ahern to the Mahon Tribunal. But, you know, it's very interesting. When the Ryan Commission report came out, what was extraordinary was the magnitude of the abuse that was exposed in that document, or volumes of documents. And people simply had no idea of the level of it. And I'm not sure whether Irish people really understand the levels of corruption and the way, the weaving in, the way they work in this country. I mean, I don't know whether other people have views on this.
I'm not sure, Karen. I mean, there was one example in the local elections this year. There was a councillor who was debarred from office. He served a prison sentence. He was convicted of using public money in an unacceptable way. He was re-elected by the public, and he was given a standing ovation by the county council when he returned to it. That was collusion of the general public. That was knowledge of corruption that was going on. That's someone who's being lauded for his position in public life, and he has been rewarded by the general public. That's where we are as a society. And if we want to change these things, we have to accept our complicity in it. Because it's not going to change by people pointing fingers and accusing people. It's a coalition of the Irish people we have to be talking about here. If we're going to be changing things in our society, we have to accept that these things happen because we let them happen.
That is all fine, and this is a fine rhetoric, and I would agree with you completely. But one thing which has been completely untouched by the entire panel so far is somewhere where you can do, as a government, right now, an impact, this second. False scandal. You could have done something about it. Your own civil servants are engaged in abuses of public trust on a daily basis. I think I speak quite loud, you can hear me from we know that is happening right now, and this is the role of government, not anybody else. It is the role of your colleagues in the Green Party to stop that and expose that, and that is not being exposed. In fact, probably the entire panel and most of this room, given the Irish psyche, is sharing the ideal of the public sector as somehow being excluded from the abuses and corruption. And when we talk about the Ryan and Mahon and everything else, we can talk for ages about that. But what's really happening in reality is behind the scene, we have the same Mercedes being used by people from FUS and Qantas, We have the same abuses of the expenses happening there. And when that bubbles up, we kind of say, oh geez, we didn't expect them to be there. But let's get more public sector spending here going. Because that somehow corrects the throwing of more money into it. We have this system which has been run for years, for decades, but bipartisan system of the social partnership agreements. This is, for anyone who has any idea what it is, it's about people sitting in a closed room and dividing your economic pie to their own benefit. Whether that happens on the business side or it happens on the social partners side, on our environmental pillar side, and every other pillar possible side. If that is not a form of corruption, geez, you know, what is? And we're surprised at that, and that's something that the government can do right now, right this second.
Susan?
If we stop being surprised, then we really have had it. I mean, we talked earlier on about how, you know, we do take a lot lying down, but I mean, I understand what you mean in principle, but in practice, actually, if we stop being surprised, we might as well fold our tents and go home and let them at it. But just by way of example of the practical things that have not been done, by the current government has refused, and I have the list here, of the various bills that, in fact, it is the Labour Party that has tried to put these in, but I'm not trying to do it as a platform for the Labour Party. I'm just pointing out the ethics in public office, the whistleblowers protection, registration of lobbyists, freedom of information reform, official secrets reform, prevention of corruption, the electoral donations to parties and candidates amendment, and the planning and development compensation bill and corporate governance. All of those have been rejected by the current government. They do not want to allow any shred or any way in which we could start to build something that allowed for more accountability. And I take your point down to a certain extent. Of course we're all in it together, but you rely on governments ultimately to legislate, to make laws, to prevent things happening or to make us all more accountable, because we all tend to, you know, go off on one sometimes and do things wrong. That's why laws are there. And this current government has turned down the opportunity consistently. Every single one of those remains just as, you know, aspirations. You may not have been party to all of that, and I'm not suggesting that you were. But that's not the point. The government that we have has failed on every single one of those. And for my money, at least those would be a start about accountability in government. And then there's accountability and, you know, more legislation for you know, banking and the financial sector. That's also to be discussed. But there are practical things we can do. You're right, sir. You know, it isn't about just moaning. But then when you look at what's tried to be done by some parties, then we're back at square one.
Okay, but
sorry, Susan, how do you make it dynamic and interesting for people to get into politics? I can tell you, I ran in the local elections this year, and it was, how did I describe it? Humbling, exhilarating, and exasperating. The difference between me as a person running for the first time and me sitting in a room full of people as me, and then someone saying, this is John, he's running in the local elections. The difference to how I was treated was extraordinary, not by people who didn't know me, but suddenly I wasn't John Phelan anymore. I was, oh, this guy is practically a politician. So I know that, but I mean, I'm not. But the point I'm making is, if people want to change politics in this country, what you have to do is you have to go back to basics. We have to encourage people to get into politics. There are some fantastic politicians in government at the moment, and in our parliament, in Senate as well at the moment. But we want and we need to get people to get into it. If we want to change politics and we think all the politicians are wrong, we just, how do we get them in? And the truth is, can you really be a politician? And not from time to time have to twist the truth.
Yeah, but maybe it's not just about change, you know, it's not about just encouraging dynamic young people to enter politics, because you want them to enter a political system.
Yeah, but they're not doing that, Karen. But you change it from the basics. You have to start there and build it.
Constantine has just given you a prime example. The false scandal was outrageous.
Just fire someone as a government.